In the name of the one and only, we welcome you back to our discussion of the perception of Islam, concentrating on the Indian subcontinent. In the previous discussion, we talked about the formative stage of the Delhi Sultanate, which was initiated by Qutbuddin Aibak, a slave of the Ghuri, Muhammad Ghuri. And we did explain then that the term slave has to be understood in its own political context, which is defined as a contract of loyalty between two individuals, usually at the higher levels of a government. And so this is the period of what is often known as the slave kings of India. And we discussed the period of the Ghurid dynasty, who pushed aside the Ghaznavids, who were doing seasonal incursions into India, but the Ghurids established a permanent state. And that permanent state had an Islamic identity, speaking jurisprudentially. It had a Persianate identity, speaking in the context of the court language and administration, and it has a Pashtun/Turkic identity in terms of the administrative and military structure of Delhi. After the Ghurids and the Khiljis or Gharji or Gharzi, we had the next dynasty, which was the Tughlaq dynasty. This would be primarily a Turkic one that continued throughout northern India, and the Khiljis, the Mamluk dynasty was from 1320 to 1414, I apologize. The Khilji dynasty was from 1290 to 1320. The Tughlaq dynasty was from 1320 to 1414. And then we have the Sayyid dynasty, which goes from 1414 to 1451, rather a short one. And that is followed by the Lodi dynasty, which is from 1451 to 1526. And I would add to that one more, which would be the Suris, and this is generally not identified as a part of a dynasty because there was a single ruler, Sher Shah Suri, who was perhaps the most dynamic and the most productive and the most, I think, in terms of he established the architect of the Delhi Sultanate, but we'll come to that. The other distinction of the Delhi Sultanate is that it had its perhaps its first female ruler in Islamic history, in the name of Razia Sultana. That again, when we look at the patriarchal order and its dominance in the male-centered Muslim societies today, it seems rather an oddity. But yes, it wasn't just the Europeans who had queens. Muslim states too had queens. Razia Sultana was the ruler of the Delhi Sultanate from 1236 to 1240, and that was probably be the peak of the expansion in terms of territorial expansion of the Delhi Sultanate, which was during the Tughlaq dynasty, and from then on the Sultanate becomes kind of weaker, and it starts shrinking, and it follows the path of decline. And again, we move to another period where the dominance of these Muslim dynasties in northern India is gradually challenged by many of the Hindu kings from around northern India. The most important of these is the formation of the Vijayanagara Empire that directly challenged the Muslims and established their Hindu empire. And then later on we also had the Bengal Sultanate, which broke off from the Delhi Sultanate. And then, of course, the disintegration continues from there on. Now, the question in terms of perception is that now we do an analysis that now that you got a historical framework, the Delhi Sultanate was instrumental in making Islam as a religion as a part of the social fiber of northern Indian society. That Muslims were not just these raiders from the north who appeared and plundered and then went back, but rather they had settled, they had established themselves in northern India. And since India is such a large subcontinent now in terms of population, the people who went to India gradually were Indianized culturally. What they wore, what they ate, where they lived, how they lived, in all that sense. So they would have had the ethnic identity of, say, Pashtuns from the north or of Turkic tribes from the north, but they had been Indianized in cultural ways. And by culture, I mean the functional culture, what you wear, what you eat, how you live, and all that. Now, then comes this next layer of culture, which would be the language and the religion and the bureaucracy of the government, the administration, the literature, and all that. And here is where, and of course the music, and here is where Islam leaves its own imprint on the Indian culture. So since the ruling class were primarily Muslim, then it's their cultural values that get established in northern India. Take the music, for example. The music gradually became, the music of India was Islamized gradually. We had the Hindu chants in their temples for their gods and their own way of life. And please understand the word gods in the singularity, plurality, in principle being monotheistic with pluralistic manifestations that I explained in the previous session. So the Muslims adopted these. One cannot ignore the fact that as the dominant class, their religion, Islam, would have become not only part of the fiber of the northern Indian society, but in the course of time it would have become accepted and perhaps endorsed and adopted and eventually believed in. So many Hindus would have become Muslim. There would be that fluidity. And this was very important, especially in the context of the caste system of the Hindu society, that if you were born in a particular caste, you had no chance of getting out of it. It was a role assigned to you for life. That if you're born in a lower caste, you could not have the that there were ceilings established for your social and political development by the society. Now, Islam, at least in principle, was more egalitarian. And the egalitarian concept of Islam were appealing to many of the Hindus, especially those in the lower castes, to get out of that caste was to turn over to the egalitarian concept of Islam, and that would have been very appealing to them. So many Hindus eventually did become Muslim. And I'm sure there were other factors too in terms of their own belief and all that, for which we don't have time to discuss. That was in terms of music, like I said. So many of the chants, the Hindu chants that used to be sang in the Hindu shrines, were eventually brought to the Muslim places of worship. And those that would have been singing, for instance, to Hare Krishna, were then replaced with chants that were attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. And it's a common knowledge that the word qul is one of the most commonly used words in the Quran. The word means say. In other words, when God is commanding his prophet to tell the people, this will come in would be introduced with the introductory relative pronoun of qul, tell them. And then there's also the sayings of the Prophet outside of the Quran, which is called also the hadith or the qawl. And from these two words of qul and qawl came the word qawwal, which is the person who quotes the Prophet, and the style of music adopted from that became qawwali. And qawwali is the most popular type of music in northern India, especially in Pakistan and in parts of Afghanistan today. Qawwali simply means people who were chanting the sayings of the Prophet and sometimes those commands of God to the Prophet to be transmitted to the people. So both the qul and the qawl part. And these would be chanted by Muslim faqirs and religious individuals, not necessarily in competition with the Hindus, but sort of in complementarity. In other words, a style of worship through music and chants and singing was adopted by Muslims because the Hindus were doing it. And so that would be a kind of a cross-pollination at the cultural level. At the level of language, as I said earlier, yes, in the early Khilji period, and before the Mughals, Hindawi was the language, and the Khiljis, being themselves Pashtuns, encouraged Pashto language and Pashto music, Pashto lyrics, as well as it's believed that there were 4 Pashto tals, and the tal is a word for which I'm not qualified to explain but it's a musical notation that accommodates the phonetic pattern of the Pashto language or the Pashto lyrics and songs and melodies that could be sang in the traditional Hindu music. And those are attributed to Amir Khusrau Dehlavi, who was the court poet and the court composer and musician of the Khiljis. We are talking back in the 1200s. So that culture melded then, and then subsequently Farsi, Dari or Persian or the Persianate language of Central Asia, of the language of the court, takes over, and that leads to the next stage where Urdu is established by the Mughals as sort of the national language, or the official language rather, of India. So at the level of religion, we got this blending. At the level of culture, we got this cross-pollination. And in many ways, even the titles were adopted across India and between these two communities. So the Delhi Sultanate sort of Islamized India, northern India in particular, in more ways than we can see. Now, this had two effects. Again, from analytical point of view, we can see that one is a negative one and one is a positive one. Since our discussion is still within the realm of the perception of Islam in history. The negative one is that the sensitivity primarily between the Hindu communities and the Muslim communities existed then and they exist now. They manifest differently. I must mention that the other two branches of Jainism and Buddhism that branched off of Hinduism were marginal in this give and take. The reason being that the Jainists were seen more as a recluse and isolated community, and the Buddhists had already been expelled from India for various reasons. Hinduism that was born in India somehow is not the primary religion of India anymore, and there is a similar pattern to the development of Christianity in Europe, that Christians were persecuted in Europe, but then the Buddhists were persecuted in India, and that's why those Buddhists who went north into Tibet and eventually to Mongolia follow one pattern. Those who went south to southern India and Sri Lanka follow a different school of Buddhism, and then those who went east into Burma and Thailand and beyond, and then eventually to parts of China and all the way to Japan, they follow a different pattern. So when you look at the majority of the Buddhist population of the world, they live outside of India, not within India, unfortunately. So the Hindus have been as bad themselves in the mistreatment of the Buddhists, and then comes the Muslims from the north, who then in their turn mistreat the Hindus. We could also talk about in terms of in literary sense, that language, literature, poetry, music and all that. But to go back to the discussion of the negative and the positive, it's that sensitivity between the Hindus and Muslims that existed in the Delhi Sultanate. I have no way of measuring the degree of the intensity, but there's no way of ignoring that when, say, a power force from somewhere else, from the north, invades the country and takes over the power, there has to be some degree of resentment. Now, this was, during the Mughals, this was perhaps reduced to a great extent. And it's inevitable to go to that period. But the Mughal period would have been one where not only were Muslims as part of the social and political fiber of the society, that they were accepted. And of course, we cannot lump together the entire Mughal period. There were high and low ebbs. There were higher and lower levels of the tensions between the two communities. And these tensions were then sometimes manipulated in a negative way and sometimes in a positive way. The negativity, as I said, would be that of the period of the clash between Dara Shikoh and the two princes, Prince Dara Shikoh and Prince Aurangzeb, towards the latter period, which was greatly manipulated by the British as they appeared on the horizon to begin the colonization of India. And the general theme was that on the positive side, the Mughals realized, and perhaps we can rewind a little bit and go back to the Suri period. Towards the end of the Delhi Sultanate, a man by the name of Farid, who is known as Sher Shah, that would be translated as the Lion King, which is where Disney takes its name from, his name, and is of course turned into the Lion King movie. Since there are no copyright protections, they don't even bother to give credit to a culture, since it's not an individual property but a cultural one. So Sher Shah Suri came to power towards the end of the Delhi Sultanate, and what he did in his short period of during the short period of his reign was to unify northern India in ways that his predecessors couldn't or didn't. His greatest contribution is what's known as the Tank Road, that was perhaps the first highway in human history. This highway stretched from East Bengal all the way to the parts of the cities that are now in Pakistan, in Peshawar and its vicinities. This Tank Road, this first highway, which probably the term Shahrah, in which would be which would connect it with the name of Sher Shah, the king, or the King Highway. And again, in modern parlance, we use the word Shahrah for that. This was to link northern India, which helped in, of course, the military incursions or the military campaigns, that if there was a rebellion in a far-flanked region of northern India, it was easy for Sher Shah to send troops through this highway in a rather shorter period of time to quell the uprising. But it also established a kind of a road of communication, and in this communication, it wasn't just the migration, but rather the connectedness in terms of culture, in terms of people moving east and west, sharing food, custom, clothes, language, literature, music, etc., etc. And it's, I think, the blueprint of what the Mughals implemented subsequently. So many scholars believe that it was the Suris who established, or rather introduced, a new form of government that tried to unify northern India. And had he not lost one battle to Humayun, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, perhaps the Suris would have been ruling India for as long as the Mughals did. But that is not a matter for us to speculate. Whatever has happened has happened. The high light of the Mughal dynasty was during Jalaluddin Akbar, and he is called Akbar, or the greatest, or the great Mughal. the great Mughal emperor, for one reason. And, well, not necessarily for one single reason, but mainly for this reason, that he brought the Hindus and Muslims together. He, as the emperor, as a Muslim, married a Hindu woman, and he established a temple for her in the palace and a mosque where the king and the queen often prayed together. However you named your god, it did not matter. It was understood for that God to be one and only one. So he not only preached and taught, but he modeled a camaraderie and a harmony by bringing the Hindu and Muslim communities together. He went a step further than that instead of having this just as a Hindu-Muslim polarity or polarized crisis, he diffused that by establishing what is called the Council of the Niners. The Hindus, or northern Indians, used to have their own village councils called the Panchayat, which was a council of 5 people, or 5 people in a village council that decided most of the social matters. Jalaluddin elevated that concept, which was very Indian, to a higher level by creating the Council of the Niners. And the Council of the Niners comprised of spokespersons, gurus, teachers, or leaders of the various religious communities, of the top 9 religious communities in India. And this became the counsel to the king, that whenever he wanted to decide on certain matters, he would send it to the Council of the Niners, and they would look at it from their own perspectives, primarily their own religious perspectives, and see if there was any contradiction, or if there was a lack of sensitivity to someone's belief system, or if certain things may not have accommodated certain principles, traits, and practices of a religious community, or simply if some religious community would have found a particular etiquette as offensive. So they will present that back to the king, and the king will modify those things and make sure that whatever decree came from the palace was not just not offending the various religious communities, but it would be accommodating them. And this kind of pluralism is very rare, that in a pluralistic society such as India, the king would adhere to certain principles of, say, religious pluralism at the community level. And that's how he was able to bring all Indians into the fold and to reduce sensitivities towards one or another religious community. This was followed by his successors to a great extent, but not necessarily by all of them. And so when Jalaluddin Akbar, like some of his successors, then brought in Indians, Hindus, into the fold of the government administration. So it wasn't just a lip service, so to say, but prominent Hindus such as Birbal, for example, became the high-ranking court vizier of the Mughals. And that brought a degree of harmony to northern India in terms of this culturally and religiously diverse society that was ruled by one. So the Mughal dynasty would have been identified, and still is identified, as a Muslim dynasty, but we cannot say that it was an Islamic government in the way many perceive Islamic, as a theocratic, singularistic form of government. Rather, it would have been a pluralistic one. And perhaps that was the cause, perhaps the major reason for why the Mughals lasted for as long as they did. Now, their fall then comes in at a different time, and that comes when European colonial powers appear on the borders of India, and they want to exploit religious difference among the Indian communities, Hindus and Muslims. The divide and conquer concept is understood by everyone now. And that would have been sort of the beginning of it, at least in the context of the Indian history. So towards the end, we had two princes, Prince Dara Shikoh and Prince Aurangzeb. And since these two were contending for power as the potential heirs apparent, those who surrounded Aurangzeb were, let's say, to use a little bit of the present-day terminology, religious fanatics. To them, Islam alone was important. They thought that Hindus got away with a lot since the Muslims were the rulers, and that the jizya tax, which any government imposes on non-believing, non-Muslim citizens, and I think we have discussed that before, that had to be reimposed on the Hindus. And let me clarify that since in a Muslim majority society, Muslim citizens are free to pay their annual income tax. I'm labeling it that way because we are talking about zakat, which is the giving to the alms, the purification of your wealth, similar to tithe. However, zakat simply means to give to the poor their share. That one of the reasons that the difference between the haves and have-nots sometimes exceed to a point of intolerance is that the rich become rich at the expense of the poor. If the poor are paid fairly in any transaction, trade, work, employment, and all that, if an employer pays an employee his or her fair amount, the difference between the haves and the have-nots will not have such a wide gap. So in terms of Muslims' religious obligation, that perhaps this has happened, whether by design or neglect or simply ignoring the facts or the arrangements. If it has happened that a particular person has earned a lot more than his needs, while his or her neighbors have a lot less than their needs, therefore it's incumbent upon those who have to share with those who qualify as the have-nots. Now, in a Muslim society, this is the duty of an individual believing Muslim. A government institution can't impose this upon you, can't administer it. However, many governments have sort of combined the concept of zakat with the tax. And so while a Muslim individual is free to give that to whomever he or she deserves, feels that they deserve it, governments have kind of brought it into the administrative fold and have kind of asked them to pay that to the government as a tax. Now, since the government cannot impose zakat, this tax of purification, on non-believers, however, governments do provide services. Therefore, the non-Muslims are asked to pay their own, the equivalent of zakat, as jizya. Now, during the early period of the Mughals, this tax, the jizya, was forgiven. In other words, Hindus and Muslims themselves could pay whatever they wanted to, whether it was part of their religious obligation or part of their civic duty to their state that provided services for them. So back to the conflict. Aurangzeb and his followers, or those who surrounded him, took this hard line towards Hindus to reimpose the jizya tax and to take away certain other privileges for them. In other words, they were driving a rift between Muslims and Hindus. His brother Dara Shikoh, on the other hand, was very spiritual. He went from a Muslim place of worship to a Hindu place of worship. He prayed with Hindus separately. He prayed with Buddhists separately. He prayed with Muslims separately. He wanted to keep in the tradition of his great-grandfather, to keep India as a pluralistic society in the religious sense as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the presence of the British on the British colonial British I'm talking about on the horizon, on the political horizon in India, resulted in this exploitation of divide and conquer in a way that the balance was tipped in favor of Aurangzeb instead of in favor of Dara Shikoh. So the end result was that with Dara Shikoh, the last probably most deserving Mongol intellectual prince being marginalized, the opportunity was then given to Aurangzeb, who pursued very harsh policies towards Hindus, and that began the rebellion, and that eventually resulted in the fall of the Mughal Empire. Although he wasn't the last emperor, but the Mughals were doomed from that day on. And that tension between the Hindus and Muslims was then exploited by the British in the early stage of their incursions from the south, and eventually when they were able to take over India as India became part of the British Empire, that difference was always exploited, and it continued even until after the departure of the British in 1948. And what we see today as the countries of India and Pakistan, and perhaps to some extent Bangladesh, is nothing but that very British policy of divide and conquer, which was in the beginning implemented so that they could divide the people of India so the British could take over, and then eventually when they had to leave, they again divided India literally into several countries, but primarily India and Pakistan. So when you look at it in modern terms, the Pakistanis or the Pakistani mindset is nothing but whatever it is, it's the non-Indian. In other words, Pakistanis define themselves as anything that is not Indian. So whatever the Indian government endorses, the Pakistanis have to oppose it. And this oppositional ideology, which has become a state ideology, and of course it is introduced in the name of Islam, unfortunately, has resulted in this rift getting wider and wider. So as a result, Pakistan becomes quote-unquote an Islamic state, which then has made India more of a Hindu state. That would not have been conceivable under the Mughals, because it works in the exact opposite direction. And it's not although India is claiming to be the world's largest democracy, which perhaps is in some sense, but one cannot ignore its promotion and endorsement of its Hindu identity. The very reason that the Hindu Janata Party came to power is, in a sense, a kind of belated reaction towards Pakistanis identifying themselves as Muslims, the Muslim League, the Muslim Party, the Muslim this and the Muslim that. So then India is doing pretty much the same thing. So India becomes a Hindu state. And the Muslims who enjoyed great privileges during the Mughals and during the Delhi Sultanate before that, and to some extent during the British India as well, although with a different motive, are becoming more and more of a minority and more marginalized, and at times even persecuted, as we saw in the massacre in, I think it was 2003 in Gujarat, under the direct or indirect influence of India's current Prime Minister, Modi. And so the idea is that there is kind of unfortunately, a revival of creating these religious tensions. We saw the worst of it during the partition, 1948, when tens of thousands of Muslims and Hindus virtually killed each other, destroyed each other, as they had to be force migrated from one or another region that the British conveniently designed and drew a geographic map on the ground. And today we have both India and Pakistan as the two nuclear states, and that is a very, very dangerous situation. Not that we don't think their leaders are accountable, but it's possible that if there is an accident, in my opinion, a nuclear accident will most likely occur between India and Pakistan rather than between Russia and the United States. And the tensions that could trigger such an accident will be the mistrust that was created by the British and manipulated by the British, and the people in the two countries have fallen victim to it, consciously or unconsciously. They play the game. At the cultural level too, the more the Pakistanis try to Islamize the Urdu language, which was the language of India, the Indian subcontinent. In India, in Pakistan, or in the Urdu language, for instance, the the etiquette for saying goodbye used to be Khuda Hafiz. And now they don't use the word Khuda. They say you have to say Allah Hafiz to Arabize it more in their perception, to Islamize it more. And there are a lot of other words that they're kind of messing up with this language that worked for so long for keeping all the communities of India, but particularly northern India, and through the entire region, that Urdu language became the regional lingua franca, perhaps, with more speakers communicating in that language. Now, I must say that this will be a language that is not necessarily the native of anyone, but understood by everyone. So if you take Pakistan, for instance, Urdu is claimed as the native language by less than 2%. By less than 2%. But it's understood by upwards of 95% of people in Pakistan. This is the definition of a successful lingua franca, which is now pushed into this realm of sensitivity. So the more words they the more they kind of quote unquote Islamize this language that has existed for the last 400 years very successfully. Now the Hindus in India then react similarly. So what they do is they replace and substitute words of Arabic origin and of Persian origin with words of Sanskrit origin. So this language that united India is dividing them. And now Hindi, which is the name given to the Urdu language spoken in India, is becoming more and more different than Urdu, which is spoken in Pakistan, and the two used to be the same language. So these tensions are now reaching a cultural level of division and separation and the intensification of sensitivities at the cultural level. So if we can, in a way, summarize the whole consequence of what happened in the last, say, roughly 1,000 years, the perception of Islam had gone through phases in the Indian subcontinent, an extremely negative period during the early incursions of the Ghaznavids, followed by a kind of understandable, for lack of a better term, in other words, not too negative, but with some positivities during the Delhi Sultanate, which in time grew more and more positive, especially during the Suri period, which was rather short, but still in terms of the positive negative, that would have been very positive. And it reached its climax during the early Mughal period, especially under Jalaluddin Akbar, and perhaps to some extent during Shah Jahan's period. And that would have been, Islam would have been positive. Islam was instrumental in forming, or rather reforming, or perhaps reshaping the culture of northern India into a new mold. And this new mold was very inclusive. Again, if we go back to the period of the Suris, they established gardens with the mosques, with the temples, with the water fountains and reflective ponds around it. When you look at the mausoleum of Sher Shah Suri, that it became the prototype of architecture in India. The Hindu architecture was a temple made of marble stones with hundreds and perhaps thousands of turrets. That was like stalagmites or stalactites, depending on whether you look at it from the inside or from outside. That defined Hindu architecture. Then comes the Delhi Sultanate, where they, for instance, take the old castle, and most of these were forts, perhaps not too different than the forts that the Crusaders built on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, except that those ones are abandoned. But the ones in India that were built again by a foreign army that felt more secure inside huge walls. So we have a lot of huge castles in India, like in the old castle, which is part of the architecture of the Delhi Sultanate that the Pashtuns and the Turks built in India, which became part of the landscape and part of the, you could say, the part of the cultural icon. And so after the Suris established this new theme of taking the Hindu temples, of a building with turrets and all that, and bringing in the element of water and reflective ponds and fountains and trees and gardens, and blending all of that together. As I said earlier, if you look at the mausoleum of Sher Shah Suri, that template was then followed by the Mughals in their architecture. And the best example of it can be none other than the Taj Mahal. So when you look at the Taj Mahal, not only in its octagonal formation, that everything has to be a multiple of 4s or 8s or 16s. This temple that took 20 years to be built, a temple that was built for no other ideal but the ideal of love, became a symbol of architecture. The building itself in many ways resembles a Hindu temple, but it has the domes of a mosque on top of it. And so that too kind of brings this blending of the two main religious communities of India, which again obviously is very positive. We also see that in India the growth of paintings, miniatures, which again in some Muslim societies they were considered sacrilege and totally forbidden. You cannot show the image of a living being, especially a human. Whereas during the Mughal period, that became not just a norm but acceptable. So the paintings are there, the art is there, the architecture is there, and that in essence is, I think, the highlight of how India was Islamized, not at the exclusion of Hinduism, but rather alongside Hinduism. In other words, India got this new identity of a Muslim Hindu identity. And this is the result of the efforts towards the later period of the Delhi Sultanate and the early period of the Mughal Sultanate, or the Mughal Empire in India, which created a very pluralistic society, which allowed for India to prosper, which allowed for India to become the superpower of the world, the envy of almost any nation on the face of earth. We cannot ignore the fact that when the Europeans idealized any place to go to, they were always talking about India. They did it on the basis of the many other Muslim scholars, poets, and writers to whom India symbolized heaven, the Garden of Eden. And we have many poems and writings from that period of the Islamic period, where when you look at it at the symbolic level, India symbolizes heaven, Behesh, Jannat, whatever term you want to use. And that is what then some European scholars and writers emulated. Paradise Lost, for example, the idea is one of India. And then subsequently we see in the colonial period and the age of discovery, the most idealized place on the face of earth for anyone was to go to India. And when Columbus was sailing, he wanted to go, of course, to India. And that's why we have the East Indies, we have the West Indies, we have East India Company and the American Indians. When the word India becomes part of almost every language in the world, it becomes that because India was the superpower of its time in terms of industry, in terms of cultural development, in terms of pluralism, in terms of the abundantness of natural resources and all that. So therefore, all in all, one could see that, to conclude this part of our discussion, in terms of the perception of Islam, then in India, for the most part, Islam would have had a positive perception in the minds of many. Unfortunately, there have been and there are hands that work in the opposite direction to work towards the division of India, or rather the denial of their pluralistic concept. And we suffer in the region from that negativity and that lack of sensitivity to belief systems and all that. In our next segment, we will explore another part of the world in terms of what is the perception of Islam, positive or negative, and what it has been throughout the course of history. And before we sum it up and bring it back to the center stage of what is often referred to as the Middle East, that I prefer to call Southwest Asia. So for now, we conclude the discussion here. I bid you farewell. I hope you have a nice day.